I read about your analogy of Linux and RISC-V. Could you elaborate more on the hidden dominant costs in terms of open source?
The analogy is not perfect. Linux, that it is open, and indeed it is open source, which means that there is source code available. Now, there is some commonality with RISC-V, but also some important differences. So what's in common? Well, RISC-V is an open standard. It is freely available. It's owned by RISC-V International. And so the further development of the standard belongs to participants in RISC-V, just like the further development of Linux is controlled by the large community of developers. But there are at least two important differences. One is RISC-V as an ISA is not open source, just like something like the C language or TCP/IP. It's a written standard, and there is no standardized implementation. So with a processor, there are two important things. One is the instruction set architecture, the ISA, and the other is the microarchitecture. Now, with RISC-V, there is no standardization of microarchitecture. You can decide to make a processor with a 3-stage pipeline or an 11-stage pipeline. You can implement the instruction set in many, many different ways. Whereas Linux has source code, and that source code base is standardized. So if we compare open source versus commercial licensing, there are a number of important differences. If you have a commercial license from, say, ARM or Synopsys or Cadence, for example, you're paying for three main things. One is the use of the ISA, which belongs to those companies. Secondly, you are paying for the microarchitecture, which is delivered as RTL, with supporting things like a software toolchain. And thirdly, you're paying for various warranties and support. With open source, you don't have to pay anything. You don't pay anything for the ISA. If it's an open source processor, you don't pay for the microarchitecture, but you are completely responsible yourself for checking that the processor works because you have no warranty. You're responsible for the EDA environment in order to implement a particular processor core for your chip. So there is a lot of responsibility that is on you. You have to make sure that it works for your particular project. So I think of open source as being a bit like an iceberg. There is almost no cost that you see, but underneath you have many costs associated with your design flow, the EDA tools and scripts that you need to get it to work, with verification to make sure that there are no bugs in it. And it's well known that some open source processors, people have discovered bugs in them. And also you need to support it with a tool chain. So, open source, it's not like being offered a free beer or a free lunch. There are costs associated with it. As a company, we're not against open source, don't misunderstand anything. In fact, we work with Western Digital on their open source Swerve cause, but we also see that some people need or prefer commercial licensing. So the cause we've developed ourselves, we use a commercial licensing model, but of course we don't charge for the ISA.
What are some technical difficulties yet to be overcome to build a RISC-V ecosystem for mobile applications?
There are different challenges in migrating away from an existing architecture. Some are more straightforward, some are more complex. With the mobile phone situation, it is probably one of the more complex cases to move away from ARM. Google dominates with Android, and so although it is possible to port Android to RISC-V, there is a whole ecosystem associated with it. For example, there is the Play Store with all the Google apps that would need to migrate. So it is a fairly complex issue, and it would ideally require the cooperation of Google in order to do that. I think RISC-V today is mainly in the area of embedded and mid-range performance cores. However, there's nothing to stop RISC-V moving up in performance. Indeed, we know that a number of RISC-V IP vendors are working on that, including ourselves. But moving the entire mobile phone world over, if you're basing it on an existing infrastructure such as Android, will take time on the software side.